you all, and welcome back to Living Unveiled with Maddie. There is something that happens when you're around the voice long enough. You become familiar with it. That familiarity produces recognition, and recognition builds trust. Over time, that trust leads to response, so that when the voice speaks, you move without hesitation because you know the sound of the voice. And that is how it is supposed to be with God. A relationship with Him is not meant to be distant or uncertain. It is meant to produce a steady, trained awareness of His voice, one that leads to clarity in direction and confidence in obedience. That kind of familiarity where recognition, trust, and response are consistent. And this is what alignment looks like. Scripture does not only show what alignment is, it also shows what happens when that alignment is tested. In 1 Kings chapter 13, there is a man whose story is very brief but exact. God gives him a direct and specific instruction. He's told to go, to deliver a message, and then to live under clear conditions. He must not eat, neither drink, or return the same way he came. Nothing about the instruction is unclear or open to interpretation or negotiation. It is complete in both what he is to do and how he is to carry that instruction through. The man hears God and he obeys. He goes where he's sent and delivers the message he was given. He stands before a king who is feared by everyone, including the prophet who should have spoken up. And yet he does not hesitate. He speaks boldly and intentionally, and he does not break under the pressure of the wrath of the king. At that point, everything appears complete. The message has been delivered, the confrontation has taken place, and from an outward perspective, the assignment seems finished. However, God's instruction was never limited to what was visible. The command extended beyond the moment of delivery. The same God who told him what to say also told him how to live. He was not to eat, drink, or return the same way he came. Those details were not optional additions. They were also part of the instruction itself. Because of that, obedience cannot be measured in parts. It cannot be defined by what is done correctly while ignoring what is left undone. A person can follow one portion of God's instruction and still step outside of what God commanded. When the instruction is not carried through to completion, what appears to be obedience in part becomes disobedience in whole. The man delivered the word, but he did not complete the instruction. Since he had not yet finished what God told him to do, he was still within the scope of that command, even though it looked like he was done. And that is where vulnerability begins. Not because he could not hear God, but because he assumed completion before God had released him. It is in that unfinished space that another voice enters. An older prophet hears about what has taken place and goes after this young prophet. When he finds him, he speaks in a way that sounds credible and spiritual. He claims that an angel spoke to him and instructed him to bring this young prophet back home. The situation shifts at that moment. The issue is no longer whether the young prophet can hear God, because that has already been established. The issue now is which voice will carry authority when another voice speaks, especially one that sounds experienced and convincing. This is where discernment becomes difficult. The choice does not appear obviously right or wrong. Refusing the older prophet could be interpreted as pride, while agreeing with him could be interpreted as humility. The decision becomes subtle, and that is where misalignment begins. It does not begin with open rebellion. It begins with misplaced submission. the man chooses to go back. He sits and eats, and in so doing, he steps outside of what God had already made clear. The break does not happen because he could not hear God. It happened because he did not remain aligned with what he had already heard. On his way back, a lion meets him and kills him. And what follows is not random. The lion does not eat him. The donkey remains unharmed. And then the lion stands beside the body. This is not chaos, it is precision. Judgment takes place, but disorder is restrained. The natural pattern is interrupted because the moment itself has become a message. This outcome is not accidental, it is direct consequences or a direct consequence of disobedience. The older prophet later returns and sees the results. The one whose words influence the decision now stands before its outcome. There is a quiet accountability in that moment because spiritual language carries weight, not only for the one who hears it, but also for the one who speaks it. When this pattern is brought into the present, it remains unchanged. The issue is not that people cannot hear God, because many do. The issue is what happens after, when another voice begins to speak. These voices are not always obviously wrong. They often sound reasonable, informed, well-intentioned. They come from people who are experienced, respected, and confident. Over time, what was once clear begins to feel negotiable. Thoughts begin to shift. Perhaps the instruction was misunderstood. Perhaps it needs a little adjustment. Or perhaps another perspective should be considered. Without realizing it, a person begins to move, not through rebellion, but through subtle adjustments. I have seen this personally. Even with the podcast I put out, when people do not understand your call, they often will try to recall you. This is not always done with harmful intent. Often it is an attempt to make sense of something they do not fully understand. However, what feels like concern can gradually become redirection. Suggestions begin to sound like wisdom, and caution begins to sound like guidance. The real issue is not how something sounds. The real issue is whether it aligns with what God has already said. The young prophet was not stopped by opposition. He stood before a king and did not break under pressure. What affected him was not resistance, but persuasion that carried the appearance of spiritual credibility. This is what makes the situation dangerous, because the greatest threat to obedience is not always resistance. It is persuasion that presents itself as wisdom. Because of that, discernment must become precise. There is a difference between being corrected by God and being redirected by people who do not understand your assignments. Because not every voice that questions you is sent to guide you. Some voices are simply trying to bring you back into what is familiar to them. This is where Christ brings clarity. Before Christ, the voice of God was encountered in moments. Through Christ, the voice of God becomes relational, consistent, and knowable. In John 10, verse 27, Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." This statement establishes a pattern. Its people are not defined by their exposure to many voices, but by their recognition of one voice. They do not move based on what sounds reasonable or persuasive. They follow the one they know. This means that clarity does not come from the absence of voices around you. It comes from the strength of relationship within you. There will always be other voices. The question is not how many voices are speaking. The question is, which one holds authority? This is why sensitivity to the shepherd must be developed over time. It is not a momentary experience, but a consistent pattern formed through knowing his word, walking with him daily, and obeying him in what seems small. In moments of pressure, a person does not rise to what they heard once, they default to what they have consistently recognized. The young prophet heard God, but he did not remain aligned. That is the call that remains for us, not only to hear, but to remain. There will come a moment when what God has said and what others are trying to say do not agree. In that moment, the alternative will not appear obviously wrong. It will feel reasonable, justified, and even wise. However, the defining characteristics of those who belong to Christ is not that they follow what sounds reasonable, but that they follow who they know. So the question becomes very clear. When another voice speaks, one that sounds right, feels right, and carries weight, will you remain with what God has already said? Because the decision is not whether you can hear him. The decision is whether you will stay aligned when what you heard is challenged. For that reason, remain close to the shepherd. Learn his voice through scripture. Follow him in what seems small and build conviction before pressure comes. Safety is not found in the ability to evaluate every voice. It is found in remaining aligned with the one who has already spoken. Those who truly belong to him do not only hear him once, they follow him all the way. Until next time, stay unveiled.